major disasters that got a lot of press in the news. I put accidents in quote because accident kind of implies that something went wrong and you didn't it was beyond your control. Well, all of these things are accidents in the sense that you didn't want them to happen, but they're not accidents in the sense that they could have all been avoided. And the thing that I want to mention is that all of them are characterized by failures in systems that are very complex and also have huge human, social, and technical elements. As engineers, we often just think our only job is to worry about this. But the reality of it is that we have to worry about all of these things. Okay? It's no good to design a system that's technically great, but no one can use it. Okay, so we'll talk about systemic accidents because that's what Hurricane Katrina and the issues related to that are all about. So a systemic accident is one that is almost inevitable, maybe not necessarily, but is a result of technological interactions that are complex and cannot be fully predicted and certainly can't necessarily be controlled. And actually I should probably update this and just do the whole talk on this stuff in Japan because this is a perfect example of what happened in Japan. Very complex systems, and they relied on a bunch of seawalls to prevent a tsunami from swamping these systems, these nuclear reactors, and obviously it didn't work. They were designed for what they thought was the worst possible tsunami, and yet here it was, far worse than they thought. And some examples of complex systems, well, nuclear power stations, great example, chemical plants, computer-controlled anything, and the air transportation system, very complicated, and they require multiple technologies to interact, all of them to work properly, and they require humans to perform correctly as things develop. And that can't always happen because we don't always have all the information we think we need. And the irony of it, the thing that's so interesting about these is we build in redundancy into engineered systems to make them safer. So in other words, we build them to have multiple systems working in parallel so that if one fails, we still have the other one, or two. And we also put in fail-safe mechanisms. This means that when something fails, it fails into a safe mode whenever possible. But those add complexity to the system. And the irony of it is sometimes that added complexity that we think is helping to solve problems actually contributes to the problem sometimes. Okay. So what is this deal with the huge problem that happened with when Hurricane Katrina struck the New Orleans area in 2005? What does that have to do with it? Well, I'll talk a little bit about New Orleans and how it is protected and what the issues are related to things and what failed. But it's an extraordinarily complicated system that not only has engineering issues, but societal issues that factor into the engineering decisions. And you'll see how that works in a second. So this is mostly a civil engineering issue, and I know there's probably no civil engineers here. But anyway, it's very interesting anyway. And electrical engineers design very complex systems as well, so we'll see. So this hurricane struck in August of 2005, and it revealed some of these ethical issues and some of the problems related to the complex system that was designed to protect New Orleans. So, New Orleans sits on the Mississippi River, which is an enormous river system. It drains probably half of the area of the continental United States. So the U.S., we call it the lower 48, main states in the U.S. Mississippi drains a huge portion of that. And the problem that we have with the Mississippi, and it passes right through New Orleans, and the problem is that we would like to engineer the Mississippi to allow navigation. New Orleans is a major seaport, surprisingly, even though it's about 50 to 100 kilometers from the Gulf of Mexico, upriver. It is a major seaport, and there are other cities farther north beyond New Orleans that are seaports, and also Mississippi is used with to transport all kinds of material north. The Mississippi, incidentally, runs from almost the Canadian border of the United States all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So a very long river system. The origins of it are a little lake in Minnesota, almost to the Canadian border. And what makes the system so complicated, part of what makes it complicated, is that you need to protect New Orleans, which was a very large city of a few million people. You have to protect it from flooding due to this river that goes down through the middle of the city. But you also, since it's very close to the Gulf of Mexico, you have to protect it from storm surges coming up through that direction. So they kind of get it from both ways. Water flowing down from the north, surging water coming from the south, from the Gulf of Mexico. And many of the complications relate to the fact that New Orleans, its elevation is actually below sea level. It's built on a swamp, and the more we've built on it, the more the swamp is subsided and lowered. And New Orleans is actually below sea level. So that's a little bit of a problem, as you can imagine. And incidentally, my family, both my parents were born in New Orleans, my grandparents were from New Orleans, so I spent a lot of time in New Orleans, and been there many times. So it's below sea level. And there's increased water comes from engineering projects upstream. So every time we decide to build a structure to prevent flooding in, say, St. Louis, the water has to go somewhere, and that means it goes downriver, and it means that New Orleans has to deal with it. So it's a very complicated system, because anything I do in Illinois, 2/3 of the way up the river affects what happens down at the end of the river, which is in New Orleans. Of course, as engineers, always have to worry about funding limitations, and these are very expensive types of projects that we're talking about, and there's severe funding limitations. There are huge political issues related to interactions between governments. As many of you I'm sure know, the United States is divided into individual states. There's 50 of them, all of whom have their own goals, their own engineering organizations dedicated to protecting their citizens, and so the legislature in Illinois wants to protect their people from flooding on the Mississippi. Really could not care less what's happening in New Orleans. So there's lots of political issues and interactions. The federal government is involved, the state governments, the city governments, it's a mess. New Orleans wasn't a very heavily populated area and growing. That has changed now after this hurricane. Its population decreased greatly. Of course, it's very difficult to predict storm velocities, tracks, and the effects of them, as our friends in Japan noticed with the tsunami. And of course, the ocean levels are rising and are predicted to rise even more, making New Orleans even more below sea level. And so, the sort of thing that I love to talk about in my classes and with engineers when we discuss Katrina is what's our responsibility as engineers when we have to deal with these very complex systems. And as engineers, we always love to divide things up into pieces and work on the small components. And that's very important. But we often, as engineers, lose the perspective, the larger perspective. So we're working on our little component. Hard to remember that there's this other component that we have to deal with in a huge system that has to be dealt with as well. So awareness of that is very important. Okay, so the Mississippi River system, third largest drainage system in the world, I think after the Amazon and the Nile. I could be wrong on who's number 2. Historically, floods all the time, and that's not a bad thing in terms of the ecology. It is a bad thing if you happen to live where it's flooding, or if you have a farm where it's flooding. Frequent changes to the course of the river. If you fly over that part of the country in the United States, you'll see all these lakes that essentially were former channels of the river. The river has moved over the years, and now there's this little lake right next to it where the channel used to be. And of course, deltas and wetlands downstream that help protect New Orleans, and I'll say more about that later. In the 1800s, people used to build levees, this word levee, to protect against flooding. A levee is, I don't know if there's a Spanish word for that, but a levee is just essentially a very large pile of dirt that is used to hold a river back and prevent flooding. And I'll show you some pictures of levees in a minute. Now, in the old days, that's really all they were. They would pile up dirt and hope for the best. They are engineered now to be a little bit more high-tech than that. But you'll find levees all over the place. I mean, there's flood control projects all over that are based on levees. Even in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I'm from, where we live in the desert, where we have a river, the Rio Grande, and in the old days it flooded. So even in New Mexico, in the desert, we had levees to prevent flooding of the river. And what was interesting is in the early days, if I wanted a levee, I just built one and did what I want, and nobody cared or had any control over the fact that I was doing this. And as I mentioned before, if I build a levee to prevent flooding in my area, the water goes somewhere, and that means it goes downstream and it becomes a New Orleans problem. So in the old days, no one worried about New Orleans except New Orleans, and people just built levees whenever they felt like it. In the late 1800s, there was an organization formed called the Army Corps of Engineers. And the Army Corps, it actually wasn't its name at that time, but that's what it's called now. It's the Army Corps of Engineers. Their job is to do these very large civil engineering projects designed to protect cities and areas from flooding, to control navigation on rivers, etc. So these are civil engineers, and their job is to tame nature, and they do a good job. That's their job. And so they built levees, locks, controls on the river, and took a very systematic approach and did take into account the bigger picture, because they were responsible for, among other things, the Mississippi River from start to finish. And so they did take a very systematic viewpoint on it. And in typical fashion, in the 1940s, after they'd been at this for about almost 100 years of engineering the river, they said, it's under control, we're done, no more problems. Well, okay, you love to think that you have no more problems, but certainly not true. And so, of course, more recently, we have found that one of the downsides, one of the problems associated with this set of levees and controls of the river is that the things that we've done to the river have caused a loss of wetlands and the barrier islands that protect New Orleans. The Mississippi River Delta, that area where it meets the Gulf of Mexico, is this huge expanse of swamps with trees, etc. Very rich area for